Good morning and welcome. We'll begin in approximately 1 minute this morning. Thank you. Good morning and welcome to the Maryland Public Service Commission. This is the second installment in our series providing background to both the Commission and the public regarding distribution system planning, both current practices and prospective reforms. As the Commission better understands the distribution system practices of its utilities, we first need to understand the utility's current DSP practices. Today, we will be hearing from the state's three Exelon subsidiary utilities, including Baltimore Gas Electric, Pepco, and Delmarva. They will explain to us their current practices with respect to the distribution system planning task force, including how they forecast for growth and changes on the distribution grid. We look forward to this presentation today. In future presentations, we'll hear from other utilities in the states regarding how they currently plan for future needs on the distribution grid. I am joined today by two of my colleagues, Commissioner Obie Linton and Commissioner Michael Richard. We will ask questions throughout. At the conclusion of the presentation to the Commission, members of the work group and interested stakeholders will be able to continue for the conversation with the utility. That portion of the discussion will not be televised, as the commissioners will leave the virtual room. At this time, I'll turn over the presentation to Mr. Justin Felt of Baltimore Gas Electric. Good morning.
Good morning. I should be sharing this momentarily. Please let me know when you can see it.
Thank you.
Wonderful. So, this is a great opportunity to come before Commission and stakeholders to present and follow up our earlier presentation. So thank you to the Commission. Thank you to all the people we've worked with on the stakeholder side, on the staff to pull this together. This is a follow-up presentation from the September 2nd overview of the distribution system. And today, the joint utilities, so including BGE, as well as Delmarva Power and Light, and Pepco, are here to present the actual process and decision-making and tools we use to make those investment decisions to build out our distribution system. So before I get into it, just some quick team introductions. I'll introduce myself. I'm a manager of strategic planning on the Utility of the Future team. On the BGE side, I'm joined by Eric Hanlon on the capacity planning team. He'll be joining me and presenting a number of slides. I'm also joined by Alex Priegel on the capacity planning side as well, who could stand by for any additional Q&A that he can contribute to. On the Pepco and Delmarva side, I'm joined by Elisa Drain on the Utility Future team. And she is also joined by Scott Placide on the distribution planning team, advanced analytics and DER, and also by Rob Stewart, the smart grid and technology team, and Mason Maddox, the capacity planning team. I should note, of course, at any point, if you have any questions during this, you can jump in. Otherwise, I'll just continue to go slide to slide. Thank you. So as I mentioned before, the first session was the basics of the distribution system, sort of a distribution system 101, if you will. At the end of this presentation, we hope that you will have a better understanding of the process, of the capacity planning process. There are different steps, there's different timing. There's a number of tools that we utilize to make those decisions, both that are in current now or in near term will be included in our Rolodex of things we can do. We'll do a little more of a discussion around load forecasting and approaches and capabilities, and then also have some discussion around DER and DER integration, which is an important part of distribution planning, but also a broader topic. And also, I will also be giving just a little bit of an overview on some of the policy pieces of this. We are receptive to the last September 2nd presentation, where we did get a lot of questions around strategy and policy. So we wanted to address that very quickly before we got into the, sort of the nuts and bolts of the capacity planning process. So, first of all, we're happy to be here at the joint utilities, so including both PHI utilities as well as BGE. We're excited to be here to engage in this conversation. Our fundamental responsibility above all else is providing reliable, affordable, safe electric service to our customers. But then we also play a role in enabling and helping implement a lot of the energy goals that are here. There's obviously a lot of players at stake, and we're just one part of it. But these policy goals, we have to be receptive to it, and sort of calling back to the NARUC-NASIA report, the objectives and goals of the DSP process should also call back to the state policy goals, and what does the commission and policymakers and customers want to see out of their distribution utility. So I mentioned a few energy goals that are here on the slide. Greenhouse gas emission reduction goals are obviously very important, something that's very close to the Exelon Utilities heart. We recently released a Path to Clean strategy and goal where we would be reaching net zero direct emissions across the utilities by 2050. So this is something that we've been vocal about, and are excited to engage in these conversations. As a part of that, there's also the renewable energy goals, the renewable portfolio standards, which includes 50% as renewable by 2050, as well as 14.5% by solar in state by 2030 as well. The energy efficiency, that's a place that is very close to where BGE is engaged. I think most clearly of the Empower program, which has both energy efficiency and demand response goals. And I think that's been a tremendous program and successful in terms of driving customer-driven reductions. Electric vehicles, there is a PC 44 stream on this, as well as the state level goal of 300,000 electric vehicles by 2025. We obviously have a very strong role there, both providing power as well as through the EV Smart program and various associated pilots where we're providing incentives, as well as building out utility-owned charging, and then a number of other things that we see in the future as our role here. And then finally, storage is an important piece of the distribution puzzle as well as the wholesale puzzle. And so, it's been a tremendous honor and privilege to be able to develop a number of projects, both on BGE as well as Pepco and Delmarva side, related to the energy storage pilot, which include both utility-owned as well as third-party-owned projects. So I sort of alluded to this before in my opening remarks. We have this traditional role of the utility, which is safe, reliable, secure, effective, power. In other words, we keep the lights on in a safe way. But now we are treading into this new world where we have new technologies coming in. We have bi-directional flows of data. We have intermittent resources. We have a number of new technologies like behind the meter solar, front of the meter solar programs like community solar. And then we also have weather impacts that come from resilience that call into the need to think differently about resilience. These are all things that are now part of this new world, which we believe we are firmly moving into. And then the final piece of this emerging, and that's where a lot of these policy goals come into play. And this seems familiar. We did adapt this from the working paper from the NARUC-NASIA task force. And we did think this was sort of a good way of thinking about how the DSP process is evolving. And I think that's a key thing is to take away from this is it's an evolution and a journey. We are right now, we're not the starting point, but we're definitely not the end point. And I think that's why the work group is a good forum to talk about which path we want to take and what's the roadmap. Now, part of this conversation is going to include distributed energy resources and the value they bring, but also the things that have to come with it in terms of our ability to accommodate and host. When I say DERs, I'm being pretty broad here. This could include things like demand response, electric vehicle charging. But with DERs, we've heard from a number of different stakeholders, and we believe this too, that they bring a lot of value to society and customers. Greenhouse gas abatement and climate benefits, especially related to behind the meter solar, electric vehicles is part of the beneficial electrification. The less particulates in the air means healthier people and children. There's also values that can be derived from the wholesale markets, as we look at how these DERs can participate in FERC Order 2222, helping bring that to light. On a localized basis, we see there can be benefits on reliability and resilience, particularly if customers have a number of DERs behind their meter, like solar plus storage, that can be a backup solution. There are also potential opportunities there for microgrids down the road. And then the idea of being, this idea of the customer benefiting from it, retail bill savings and getting the customer feeling that they're a prosumer. But with that comes the idea that our grid needs to evolve to allow us to enable, to communicate, and to potentially control these DERs in a way that allows us to host and really unlock that value. That would include, the software solutions, which are a part of our current plans, advanced distribution management systems, ADMS, or DER management systems, forecasting and hosting capacity tools, some of which we'll go through today, but those will also continue to evolve and continue to be more complex and be able to handle all the things that are coming through. Pilots and demonstration projects, I think those have shown value, and I think those will have to continue for us to be able to bring those DVR values to light. And then finally, communications infrastructure, so we can have bidirectional communication. It can be dynamic with low latency. In that, not only is talking about fiber, but also the equipment that goes along with communications. And I will be speaking more to this later. And before I hand it over to go into the the technical processes, just to reiterate some of our foundational principles as we go down this path. We've said this before, and we've heard it, from commissioners as well. The importance of the utilities maintaining the authority of the distribution system is paramount for us. We own the important responsibility of keeping the lights on reliably and safely, and because of that important responsibility, we need to be able to have the authority of the investment decisions that underlie it. It is a complex system where we have clear line of sight of what needs, the best ways to invest. Not to say we also invite this process where it can be more transparency and invite that, but as well, the ultimate decisions would reside with the utility. The second point that I want to bring up is, seems pretty true on its face, but it's important that the balancing competing objectives is something that we need to consider, since there are many policy objectives that will be brought to bear, many that are very, very important. How do you balance them? How do you weight them, especially relative to cost? And these are all important discussions, and we really will be listening, to both commission and stakeholders in terms of how we balance these competing objectives. And then, where a stakeholder process does exist, we expect the whole process to be defined in advance. So we should be thinking about how will this DSP process evolve? What will be the timeframes of it? Who will be, what are the different actors and when do they come in? All in a transparent, in a transparent process and under the jurisdiction of the commission. And with that, I will get now to the more technical part of the presentation. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Justin. So I'm going to walk through a high-level overview of our capacity planning process, as well as the load forecasting step. And my intent in the presentation part of this is to really hit on the high level, hit on the wave tops, and then, as Justin mentioned, we have our technical team on the line here to address further questions and provide detail as needed in the Q&A portion of today's session. So at Exelon, the capacity planning process is really a continuous and comprehensive process where we're looking to assess and ensure we're meeting the short and long-term needs of our system. We've broken this process down into 4 key steps here. The first, the load and DER forecasting. Here we're incorporating an array of input and data points, running sophisticated analytical models to generate the short and long-term load and DER output for our system. We're then overlaying that information on the physical layout of our system and looking to identify any areas where we have constraints or violations of our planning criteria. And we take those issues into the solutions development phase. At that point, we're running through and looking at a wide array of approaches to address those issues or constraints. And that can be anything from operational changes to looking at both wires and non-wire solutions. And then we're running a thorough evaluation process, including peer and management reviews, to really look at identifying and selecting the best approach to address that issue that then goes into the implementation phase. Running the planning process in annual cycles, though of course, from start to finish for a specific solution can certainly unfold over multiple years. And then we're also continuously monitoring the performance of our system so that we can identify any emerging issues and address those outside of those annual planning cycles. Next slide. Before I go on to talk more about load forecasting, I wanted to take a moment to make an important distinction between load and revenue forecasting, because I do think these concepts do get confused in some cases. So from a capacity planning perspective, we're really focused on load forecasting. And this is a really thorough bottoms up analysis of our system where we're identifying the short and long-term energy requirements. This is done on a feeder by feeder basis and is really focused to ensure reliable operation of the system. Revenue forecasting is really a separate financial planning process. That's more of a top-down analysis where we're looking at an array of data points, doing econometric analysis, but it's really at that point customer focused and helping to inform our rate design and development. Next slide. So looking overall at load forecasting, and again, this is a high-level overview. Starting with the inputs, we have a wide array of data points and information that's feeding into this process. And the list I have here is by no means comprehensive in terms of the data that we're looking at. For DERs, we're looking at existing DER programs, what's currently on the system, and how that's been performing historically. We're also looking at what's in our interconnection queue. We're looking at historical system loads, reviewing AMI data. And then we're also pulling in new business requests and other information we have about new project expectations and other sources of load growth on the system. All of that is then getting taken into this analytics step. We're running sophisticated analytical models now that are increasingly moving beyond just a straight line trend analysis and looking at better kind of data analytics approaches, especially with respect to getting better insights and forecasts into some of the new technologies and trends where we may not have as much historical data. This includes working with expert consultants and industry associations to develop data sets and models for customer adoption of new technologies and programs. And then we're also doing a lot of sophisticated analysis on weather normalization. And I'll note that this is still relatively new turf, and the ways that we can incorporate more data and look at these models, are certainly evolving, and our capabilities are evolving here with these new planning requirements that Justin mentioned. So these models are feeding into our final short and long-term forecasts. Again, these forecasts are developed on a feeder by feeder basis, and they roll up to the substation level. And I want to note a couple of things about the forecasts. First, these really do represent the best information and assumptions that we have at the time we're conducting the forecasting process. And we are updating these forecasts on an annual basis to reflect new and better information as we have it. The other thing that's important to consider is that our forecast is really looking at the outer limits of what we're expecting for load on our system. We want to make sure that we're preparing not just to operate reliably and safely on an average day, but they're really prepared to withstand and maintain the same levels of safety and reliability under extreme weather conditions. Next slide. So we know there's a lot of interest in DER integration, for this working group. So we wanted to take a moment to go a little bit deeper in this area and also draw some distinctions between how we're looking at this in the forecasting process as well as for interconnections. So, from the load forecasting perspective, what we're really looking to understand is, what the level of DER output is going to be on our system and how that's really working to offset customer loads to draw into the final forecast. Looking at and planning for the specific impacts of projects, that are seeking interconnection is a little bit separate from this kind of core forecasting process. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. So for the forecast, as I mentioned, we're looking at what's existing on our system and seeing how, those resources and the programs are currently performing. We're also looking at what's in our interconnection queue to develop an estimated output for all of those resources. And that's factoring in, coincidence factors and other variables. So we can really look at how much of that output can we really count on to be offsetting customer load on that specific feeder. So once we've calculated that, again, run that analysis, we're taking that off of the total customer demand on that feeder to generate our final short and long-term forecasts. Next slide. So Exelon, we're really implementing a similar framework across all of our operating companies with respect to load forecasting. But we do want to note that there are some differences. Justin mentioned, we talked about this in our previous presentation, that this is a journey and we're continuing to evolve here. So we are all at slightly different parts of this process. But at the same time, we're working together, not just in Maryland, but also with our sister companies and other jurisdictions, as well as industry peers, to really identify lessons learned and align to best practices. For Pepco and Delmarva Power, we've been early adopters of some of the advanced analytic methods that I've mentioned. In these territories, we're able to provide weather normalized hourly or 8760 forecasts on a feeder by feeder basis. This provides us that more granular level of information as we're evaluating and enabling more DER integrations. We're also able to disaggregate our customer load from DER load by each technology type, which enables us to really focus on, developing and adjusting the best sort of assumptions and information related to those specific technology types. And then we have sophisticated data analytics and modeling, such as the use of stochastic modeling for weather normalization, that's really enhancing and adding more confidence in our final load forecasts. And from here, I'll hand it to Eric to talk a little bit more about Baltimore Gas and Electric, as well as walk through the remainder of the planning process.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you very much, Elise. Thanks to the commissioners for giving me an opportunity to share more on our distribution system planning process here at Exelon. As my colleagues mentioned, the forecast process is key to the success of understanding what's going on the distribution system. And we are on a journey, a transformational journey we're undertaking here at Exelon. We're learning and growing the capabilities of our capacity planning tools. The advanced forecast system is pivotal to our being successful in our strategic and aspirational goals of continuing to being a dependable service provider. And with that, BGE is undertaking, exploring, and investigating new capabilities from a forecast tools perspective to help us being a sustainable steward and driver for a path to clean that supports the Maryland clean energy goals. The capabilities we are presently evaluating looks at disaggregated and segmenting our loads from DER to support DER integration and awareness of things of like EV growth. So we both on the residential and fleet side, so we can prepare the distribution system for the ever-changing needs of the customer. We anticipate piloting software in 2022 with a full implementation before the end of 2025, where we should be realizing these advanced forecasting capabilities. And we intend to approach this in a crawl, walk, run method and learn and improve as we go. Next slide, please. The forecast phase provides inputs into how we assess the distribution system. And the forecasting feeds assessment and provides necessary to help with the assessment of the system in regards to identifying where we have certain constraints on the system. The forecast data, along with the system monitoring from our substation and our meters through AMI, provides the needed data that feeds into our simulation tools that we utilize to perform these assessments. These assessments also take into consideration the COMAR standards and also industry and performance requirements that we utilize in creating the power flow and the analysis and looking at how the forecast, how we are forecasting the expected criterias that are broken. The tools and systems utilized the assessment will be required. The tools and systems that are required has to go through a certain level of transformation to meet the ever-changing needs. These transformation we are presently exploring, looking at how we can evolve the tools we currently use to do the integration of the DER and identify the benefits the DER provides to the system. The new capabilities requires us to model the system and inputs the data provided by the AMI and all the monitoring data provided at the substations. These then leads us to, next slide, please, leads us to identifying solutions for those criteria. The solutions then goes through a rigorous evaluation where we're looking at cost, we're looking at operations, we're looking at whether we can solve some of these constraints through transferring load from one feeder to another, load from one transformer or one substation to another, looking at different types of whether we need to add new feeders or new transformers or new substations. Looking at non-wires solutions is also considered as an alternative in the overall evaluation. As we go through the identification evaluation, the cost, the operational impact, the projects that are in flight, the available resources and the lead time all goes into how we select a solution, taking into consideration the trade-offs between multiple projects that are in flight. This is a very complex process we go through in how we identify the solution, which incorporates interacting with multiple teams within the utility on how we get to the design and engineering for implementation. Next slide, please. Now, we select different solutions for constraints we identify on the system. These different solutions can be either extending a feeder, building a new feeder or a new substation or upgrading the substation. And each solution takes a certain amount of time. They range from 6 months to 12 months on doing more of the small extensions, to 5 years on building a new substation. Now, some of these constraints are there to meet a customer's need by a certain date. A date that the solutions have to be put in place, start and put in place in certain time. So we're always looking at how long it takes for each solution for us to put the solution, when we actually start putting that solution in place. With our experience deploying some non-wires solutions such as energy storage, we've identified that it takes around 1.5 to 2 years to put a battery solution in place. It requires us to manage this entire process, implement this entire process, utilizing standard industry standard project management processes, engineering and design, and constructability methods. With all that gets in the investment plan, and the investment plan and the resource plan is utilized within the implementation process to get these solutions in time for our customers' needs. Next slide, please. Now, I'll walk us through a planning scenario here for a large area that is being developed, but it is being developed in a highly utilized substation area. As you can see, hopefully, that in a approximately 10-year window, we can identify from this growth that around 7 years out, this development is going to cause for the load on the transformer to exceed our criteria. And in such, we need to prepare a solution and a project in place to help mitigate this forecasted overload on the transformer. This forecast then determines what, and the projects that's been identified then determines what investment is needed to remediate this overload condition. And hence we plan for projects and put projects in time, and to start in time to meet this forecasted constraint. Next slide, please. Once a solution has been identified, which goes through multiple alternatives, we look at multiple alternatives, which a non-wires alternative is usually included. The teams meet and identify which solution would make sense to mitigate this transformer overload. It requires looking at what the scope is, looking at what goes into the permits, what goes into long lead equipment, and all this goes into the scope and goes through the analysis, whatever the cash flow, identifying which path makes the right solution in time to mitigate the expected overload. Once that solution has been identified, we go through a very rigorous project review and approval process. And then within the next year or two, we would start the project in time so we can put the solution in the field in time to mitigate what was forecasted. And with that, I turn it over to my colleague, Elise.
Great, thanks, Eric. So we talked a fair amount in the previous educational session about how the introduction of DERs and other emerging technologies are really changing how when, and where customers are using energy. And it's really challenging how we operate our system. The introduction of bidirectional power flows is changing the way utilities in Maryland and other jurisdictions have designed and operated the system for decades. And these changes are really requiring additional investments to enable that electric grid that's going to have the interactive capabilities, the controls to enable the higher penetrations of these technologies, meet Maryland's goals, and really be capable of unleashing the value of a lot of these resources that we're seeing on the system. So at Exelon, we are, making a lot of investments to ensure that our system is going to be DER ready. We talked about this as in a journey, and that we're, moving along that path. So we're investing in a lot of the system protection, communication networks, automation and control systems, so that we are preparing our system to handle these sort of increasing penetrations of DERs. But in the meantime, we still do need to look at maintaining the safety and reliability of our system and ensuring that the interconnection of a specific project is not going to jeopardize that and cause impacts for other customers. So we are offering increasing transparency and providing tools to give customers and developers more information about how they can optimize the placement of DERs on our system. But at the same token, we're evaluating each of those interconnection applications to ensure it can connect safely, reliably, and any system upgrade costs are typically going to be assigned to that specific project. We do want to note that the interconnection working group under PC44 has been looking at this interconnection process and is in the process of making proposals with respect to cost recovery and looking at these methods. So I won't speak in any further detail on that here today, but it's something to note that it's an area for collaboration among this DSP and some of the other working groups within PC44 as we're looking for the right solutions for Maryland. And with that, I want to hand it over to my colleague Scott to talk a little bit more about some of these customer-facing tools and how we are approaching interconnection requests.
Hey, good morning. Thank you, Elise. Just give me a thumbs up if you can hear me all right.
You're good.
All right. Perfect. Always got to check in these circumstances. But thank you again for the opportunity to talk through some of our practices in place with the Exelon utilities. So the Exelon utilities have been developing our knowledge, standards, and tools to efficiently assess the impact of DER integration that has to the existing grid and the future grid operations for safety and reliability. Exelon utilities have developed or are developing a series of public-facing maps intended to guide interconnecting developers and customers for siting and sizing their projects. The first map here shown is the restriction feeder map. This map represents a current assessment of active and pending DER capacity and shows customers where size restrictions for large systems are put in place to preserve capacity for small DER participation before hosting capacity is consumed by a potential few large systems in an area. The next map in the center shows the hosting capacity maps. These maps represent an estimated remaining capacity for new DER interconnections on a feeder before power quality or operational reliability issues are possible. The utilities calculate these values using power flow modeling and simulation software that uses a high volume of DER penetration scenarios to approximate a range of allowable DER capacity at the feeder's current configuration. The last map all the way on the right shows the heat maps. This map represents the amount of pending and active distributed generation on a feeder. This map can be used in coordination with the other maps to guide DER projects on feasibility of interconnection for a particular location and size. For instance, an area with high hosting capacity and low DER penetration is likely a good candidate for a larger capacity project. The next slide. All right. Additionally, the Exelon utilities are using the power flow modeling simulation software to assess the impacts of proposed DER interconnections for the safe and reliable operation under variable operating circumstances. this to ensure safety and reliability for all customers and utility field crews. And it's similar to why the utilities would assess other requests to interconnect unique or large loads. These assessments analyze the potential impacts to the grid and identify where investments may be required to accommodate the size and location of interconnection requests. Some examples of system limitations that the software can identify include impacts to voltage outside of the operating standard service requirements, misoperation of system protection devices due to potential multiple fault current sources or masking of existing loads, overloading of equipment beyond its ratings, the causing of excessive operations in voltage and power controlling equipment, which would result in excessive wear or operations of equipment outside of its operating ranges, or power quality issues that could cause customers with or without DER interconnections. These assessments are rigorous and intensive, and they're to ensure the interconnection can be accommodated safely and reliably to the grid, and any required upgrades that are recommended are prudent to the allowable operation of the DER request. And with that, I'll hand it back over to Elise.
Great, thanks, Scott. So, we hope this presentation today has been helpful to shed some light into our capacity planning processes and capabilities. At Exelon, we're really striving to implement data-driven analytic approaches to our load forecasting and system planning, and really striving to move towards integrating new technologies, best practices, and really achieve modern DER-ready grid of the future. We recognize that this does introduce, and especially the new policy objectives and emerging planning requirements that Justin spoke of earlier in the presentation, are introducing a need for more stakeholder transparency, input, and collaboration into this comprehensive planning process. And we really do welcome the opportunity to collaborate within the DSP working group as a forum to really kind of work through a lot of these issues and challenges and identify the right solutions for Maryland. And with that, we'll close and turn it over for any questions.
Great. Thank you, Elise, for that presentation, as well as to your three colleagues. I've learned over the past 40 minutes that this is actually more of a science than an art in terms of planning these forecasts and accommodating for DERs going forward. So one question: as you anticipate increased stakeholder engagement, and this is new territory for all of our utilities who have been more accustomed to working within their organizations and planning for the future. We heard a lot of discussion from you and Rich regarding all this data that's being collected, whether it be AMI data or other inputs that you evaluate in making these forecasts. How comfortable is the Exelon utilities in sharing this data with stakeholders going forward? Because obviously you're expecting them, I would expect that you're anticipating that they will be asking for access to this data. Some of it may be confidential or marked for non-public use. So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, I'll take a kind of first crack at that and ask my colleagues to chime in. I think the answer to that is going to be kind of different depending on the different pieces of data. There's a lot of different inputs that go through, and there's certainly going to be some of those data sources where, we have requirements to protect the confidentiality and privacy of specific customer data. We have the obligation to maintain the safety and security of, critical assets on our system. So there are going to be pieces of that information that we're not going to be able to share at all. There might be pieces of that information, various data sources that, that perhaps with a select group of stakeholders and under confidential basis, we can share for the purposes of that process. And then I think there are probably other pieces of information that that can be shared, and that frankly we're going to seek a lot of stakeholder input to make sure that we have the best and the greatest information and assumptions, especially as we're looking at some of these new technologies and and how we should be factoring how they perform on our system, and what we're seeing for the growth on that. So I think there's going to be a range, and it's something we'll need to thoroughly review across all of those different data sources to reach the right solution.
I think it's going to be a challenge. I know that the Narragansett Task Force touched on this somewhat. I'll be asking the same question of Potomac Edison and Southern Maryland Electric Cooperative when they make their equivalent presentation going forward. But I think it's something that Exelon should be looking at now. I do appreciate the principles that you sketched out. I believe it was on slide 6, where we need to have a plan reduced to writing in place, time limited, and subject to the commission's jurisdiction. I think setting up those guardrails early will help avoid any potential argument down the road as the parties, I think all the parties have the best intentions in mind. But with this enormous wealth of data, and as you mentioned, some of it may be confidential for privacy reasons, but to the extent that the utility can provide as much data to interested stakeholders, I think that would be very important. Let me inquire of my colleagues if they have questions for the Exelon team. Commissioner Linton.
Chairman, and good morning, everyone. I thank you for the presentation. I think it was very helpful. Just get us a little closer to trying to structure this work group in a way that will be useful not only for the commission but for the company. I guess my question is similar to the chairman's, but I'm going to approach it from a different perspective. You on slides, so I'll go to slide what is it, 16, I think it is. You have an example of a planning scenario, and I thought this was pretty interesting to me because this kind of scenario that you've listed here almost kind of invokes the process that you've got listed throughout the earlier slides in this deck, where hopefully this scenario was already forecasted. And if so, then there's an assessment and solution and eventual implementation process. So it almost seemed like you were, the company, certainly correct me if I'm wrong, but the company kind of approaches these on both a macro and a micro basis. So that on a macro basis, that's where the forecasting comes in. And we've seen some of that at the commission on some of our transmission discussions with PJM, where there's kind of this long-term forecasting relying on business trends and usage trends across many years of time. But also then there's this response to activities that happen on a more regional or local level. So I'm curious as to how we integrate that type of process into what we're trying to put together now in forms of a work group. How do we make it so that the work group parties are able to participate in this kind of process and help to develop solutions that the commission is looking for?
Well, let me take a first pass at that, and then, Eric, you may be able to add some further insights from that example. I think one thing I've observed learning about our capacity planning processes is, as we're looking at our system in load forecasting and planning for the needs of the system, as I mentioned, we are looking at the granular level at a feeder by feeder basis of, what we're seeing and projecting in terms of the growth and performance of our system. And we're factoring in, as mentioned, a lot of data sources. So we're looking at where we might see those real pockets of load growth. Let's say, you have a community that's planning a new town center or something like that, and you're seeing a lot of load growth in a specific area. I think oftentimes we're seeing that development and that kind of growth progress over time. So we have a fair amount of time to see that start to emerge in our long-term forecasts and start to look at how we're going to address those needs and, any reconfigurations or investment in our system. And then as we're refining our forecasts on an annual basis, we're getting better visibility on the specific, kind of timing and anticipation of that requirement. But again, all of this is really based on, on the actual information and the trends that we can pull out of our data. I think we have talked a lot about how some of there are broader policy objectives that we need to be factoring into the planning processes as well that might not necessarily be reflected in the historical trends. And I think that's one area where we're certainly seeing that need for early collaboration and thinking about the planning processes differently as we engage across, the utilities, regulators, and policymakers to look at how we can use the planning process to achieve some of these policy outcomes. Eric, anything else that you want to add in terms of, specifically how we're approaching planning in those types of scenarios?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner Linton. I'd like to just clarify, your question is in regards to, as we are looking at those plans long term, how do we see engaging with the external stakeholders on those projects? Am I correct?
That captures a portion of it, yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you for the question. In regards to, as we forecast and identify certain possible constraints on the system of this sort, right? There are certain times within those windows where we have to have a trigger, right? A trigger for a solution. Giving you a few examples here, we could have a data center that is interested in connecting to the system, and they're looking to connect in the system, say, in less than a year, right? And we need to get something in place ahead of time. That the time constraints on that is something that we will have to start evaluating and looking at what are the possible solutions that we could engage on. And there's some that once you pass a certain trigger time, because the utility is responsible for making sure that we can serve that customer. And those are some of the things that I think we will have to flush out a little bit more within the working group. And then there are other opportunities where we do have the foresight, maybe 3-4 years out, where it gives us a little bit more time to effectively communicate and look at other alternatives other than the internal ones that were considered. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think that touches on my concern. Work groups are structured, well, we can try to structure it any way we'd like to, but I think the point that I'm looking at here is we really have two different processes going here, and it might even be more than that, but at least from this presentation today, I pick up on two different processes, both the long-term planning, where a number of the policies that the state is looking to pursue, both environmental and otherwise, where there's opportunities to utilize the company's tools and the long-term forecasting to figure out how to incorporate those policies in. But at the same time, you just have the way business develops as it develops. If a company decides that they'd like to build a big building and it needs power, it needs resources, and it needs to interconnect to the company's system, that's going to require a different type of analysis. And at least from the presentation that I've heard this morning, both of those happen at the same time, depending on just whenever the call comes in, to simplify it. So that's kind of where I'm trying to understand how we would structure the work group and then manage the expectation for an end result so that we have something that achieves the goal that we're looking to achieve as part of designing the work group. So I'd like to figure out how we design it in the front end so that when we finish, when the commission issues whatever concluding order or directive that we do, that it actually does what we'd like it to do, as opposed to issuing a series of directives or orders or what have you that really doesn't achieve much. So I guess you can discuss it a little bit. It may be more of a comment than a question, but really just trying to think through how that happens. And that might be something the work group can work on as as you continue when we leave.
Justin, would you like to pull on that a little bit?
Yeah, you're hitting at some key points, and I think one of the things we need to be thinking about is how we structure the work group. We are level setting and setting up, the information so people can make decisions and move forward. But one of the things when you talk about engaging with the stakeholders, a key point of engagement with stakeholders is going to be at the work group. And I think we put this in our comments. One of the places we need to start is thinking through objectives and goals. And I know the JADE roadmap, went into this in more detail. But one of the things that will be really important at the beginning, and it can be, from staff, we can be a part of this, is, what are the objectives? What are we looking, how do we assess the different state goals in a way that helps make this transactional and helpful for those involved? And so I think, if there's a way, and we are open to helping and being supportive and anything that's needed to start developing those objectives and goals. And of course, staff, commission, stakeholders can be part of that as well. I think that's a good starting point for the work group so that we get to a conclusion that will be helpful for all involved.
All right, thank you for the opportunity for the question, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for the answers from the company.
Thank you, Commissioner. We'll turn to Commissioner Richard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I also want to thank the utility for the presentation today. I think it was very helpful, and also it provided some good insight as to how the current process, planning process, is conducted. I have a very hopefully it's not the exact same question, but a very similar, I guess, line of questioning around what the chairman and Commissioner Linton discussed, and I'm interested to know the endpoint points in the future for stakeholder engagement. At this point, I don't see a lot of areas where that's happening, but I think in the future, as we're looking at solution identification, I think we want to have an opportunity for input as to what it is we're trying to achieve, whether it's environmental or just coming up to least cost solutions, and then opportunities for solution identification, and then also alternative evaluation, because in some cases there might be opportunities for third parties to provide services, particularly in the area of storage. So I'd just be interested to know if there's been some thought as to, and this would probably go into the work group, but where those input points might be, and how the utility can open up to again engagement with stakeholders. And again, that was, I think, one of the intents of going with the multi-year rate plan as well, is to really open up the process so it's not always already a fait accompli when it comes to rate case time. So anyway, I'd be interested in any thoughts and comments on that.
Absolutely. And we're certainly looking on our end at where we can identify and introduce some opportunities for more input and engagement throughout the process. I think we've been a little reluctant to go too far into kind of providing details in this setting on any proposals or thoughts we're having. Because to piggyback on Justin's comments, we do want to make sure that we are using the work group and the intent of that process and the frameworks, frankly, that the NARUC and ACO task force outlined, to think about aligning our objectives and what that end state looks like in terms of stakeholder input. And we certainly don't have all the answers there. And then we can really identify where the gaps are and some of those solutions. As we mentioned before, I think there's certainly places where we can look to incorporate more input in reviewing the data sources and the inputs that are coming into that process. And that's going to be one key area to be looking at for more inclusivity and transparency. And then, as you mentioned, in the solutions development, we absolutely see a growing role, to be, looking more creatively about how we're solving for those constraints on the system, and thinking about where third parties can have a role. And I think there we're really going to want to understand what that information sharing looks like, especially also going back to some of the points that Eric made in terms of the time frame. We need to make sure that we're able to make timely investments and we have the time to put those solutions into service. And, so we'll have to kind of factor in how that plays out as we look at what that end state would be. Anyone anything else to add there?
Then I guess my second question would be just around the concept of performance incentive mechanisms. I asked a question about that in the previous session. As I expressed last time, sometimes I'm a little concerned that just the cost of service mentality, we approach things now, may not be the way that as we look to the future, planning the grid, the best way to come up with those optimal solutions, or those solutions that may include third parties. What is the company thought on performance incentive mechanisms as probably an approach to make it, the process more, I guess, attractive to a cost of service, entity like yourself? And has there been any consideration at this point of proposals that we might consider or might be considered during the work group process?
Yeah, absolutely. And we certainly are supportive of looking at PIMs, and we've, I think proposed some in the past. Rob, are you on to speak in a little bit more detail to PIMs?
Certainly. And I think I mentioned during the previous presentation, we did propose some performance incentive, some tracking PIMs in our Maryland MYP. But I definitely think that we're not opposed to it. I think through the working group process, it would be interesting to note kind of what those PIMs would be relative to interconnection of DER. But I don't think that we've demonstrated a lack of interest in pursuing what a PIM structure might actually look like in this case. But I think the direct answer is I don't think at this point we have a clear set of potential metrics that we could apply. But I think through the working group process we could get there pretty quick.
Okay, well, thank you for that. And for me, anyway, as when we adopted the multi-year rate plan, it was important to me that we also pair that with a PBR PIM process as well. So I hope the utilities move beyond just not opposing and really begin to try to consider how we can embrace this concept as we look to the planning process for the grid of the future, and trying to really integrate the intent of the state, the desire of the state to advance environmental and some of its renewable energy goals. So anyway,
Certainly.
thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Commissioner. It sounds like we do have a commitment from at least our Exelon utilities to work collaboratively with the stakeholders. Obviously, there will come cause for disagreement along this path at some point. The Commission is here to resolve any rough patches that we may experience. However, I think we have developed a relatively good roadmap in the task force products, particularly what came out of the JADE cohort. So I'd like to thank Elise, Scott, Eric, Rob, and Justin today for their presentation. What will happen at this point is that we'll turn the reins back over to staff. Participants will have an opportunity to use the Q&A function in WebEx to ask questions. Advisor Molly Knoll will help to facilitate that. And for any viewers on YouTube, if you wish to actually participate in the discussion, you could switch over to the WebEx link, and then you could participate with the rest of the interested stakeholders. At this point, the commissioners will depart the room, and the video feed will be cut from YouTube. But thank you again to our 3 Exelon utilities today for providing us with that background. There will be additional installments of this DSP background session, so stay tuned for the dates of those. Again, thank you for joining us this morning. We will see you soon.
Good morning. For those of you who are staying in the meeting, I'm going to put up a slide for the YouTube folks, sending them over here to the WebEx link, and we will start the Q&A portion at 11:15. So everybody can take a break, get a drink of water, and we'll see you in about 12 minutes.